Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much for coming together for the screening of this really wonderful film, Kiss the Ground. We had almost 1,000 people signed up for today, but we have competing news out there that make it challenging. Let me go ahead and start with introduction. We have a great panel for you. My name is Klaus Meger. I've been a volunteer with CCL for about 6 years, and for the last two, I've been sector leader agriculture for business climate leaders. We are honored today to have with us Kiss the Ground's co-founder Finian Makepeace, strategic advisor and climate policy expert Carla Rose Ostrander, and founder of Sustainable Harvest International, Florence Reed. Thank you everyone for being here. Finian Makepeace is the co-founder, policy director, and lead educator of Kiss the Ground and a renowned presenter, media creator, and thought leader in the field of regenerative agriculture and soil health. His dedication to inspiring participation in global regeneration, starting with soil, has motivated him to develop training programs, workshops, and talks designed to empower people around the world to become advocates for this growing movement. Carla Rose Ostrander is an independent consultant who works with individuals and organizations in the regenerative agricultural space. Her most recent work has been with People, Food and Land Foundation, supported by philanthropist Jenna Keane. She has spent the last 6 years as a strategic advisor, communicator, and activist working to scale compost production and a model of regenerative agriculture developed by the Marine Carbon Project across California and the Western United States. She previously worked as a fellow with the Rocky Mountain Institute and spent 10 years developing local climate policy for the city of Aspen and the city and county of San Francisco. Florence Reed is the founder and director of Strategic Growth, Sustainable Harvest International. She's a prize-winning thought leader and innovative practitioner who believes that when people work together, things can change for the better. This belief led her to serve as a Peace Corps volunteer in Panama in the early 90s. In 1997, Flo founded Sustainable Harvest International, a nonprofit organization dedicated to working with rural Central American communities to implement regenerative farming practices and preserve tropical forests. She is a delegate to the Opportunity Collaboration, Regeneration International General Assembly, and Environmental Laureates Convention, as well as a member of advisory committees for the National Peace Corps Association and board member of the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance. Flo is currently focused on her organization's plan to help 1 million farmers shift to regenerative farming by 2030 and draw down 16 million tons of CO2 per year. The Returned Peace Corps Volunteers for Environmental Action are a co-sponsor of this event. Citizen Climate Lobby, or CCL, is an international NGO with some 200,000 participating individuals, mostly in Canada and the US, where we have coverage in every congressional district. CCL's mission is to develop the political will for a livable planet. Our current focus is a carbon fee and dividend legislation that levies a fee on the CO2 equivalent of fossil fuels and returns the revenue to households. The legislation is titled the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Because we recognize that reducing emissions will not get us to a livable planet, we also support policies that aim to remove carbon from the atmosphere. For example, CCL is supporting the bipartisan Growing Climate Solutions Act, which would pay farmers to sequester carbon into the soil on a per ton basis. Business Climate Leaders is an action team of CCL. Our mission is to engage businesses from diverse sectors of the economy in promoting the legislation and policies that CCL is supporting. So the question we're asking, how will a carbon fee impact the agriculture sector, and can carbon markets be designed to equitably pay farmers on a per ton basis for the sequestration of carbon to offset that impact? We have gotten many questions already, so we would like to start, and then with questions we have already streamed out of your questions here. And And then please go along, keep posting into the Q&A. We have a team standing by that sorts through this and then passes these questions on to me. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the first question, Finian, I have for you. The film discusses regenerative agriculture as a solution to our climate issues. For the novice, and we have a lot of people here who have some really very basic questions how this all works. What are the differences, evolution, or similarities between the terms organic, permaculture, sustainability, and regenerative agriculture?
Hey, Klaus, thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining. It's an honor to be here. It's a big question, and I'll try my best to answer. I think first off, it's important to recognize that regenerative agriculture is something that has emerged from many facets of agriculture in different areas, several of which you've just mentioned, as well as indigenous wisdom knowledge. One of the easy ways to distinguish and why we are really looking at the opportunity and hopeful around regenerative agriculture is the basic premise of it. And I encourage my advocates when I train them to talk about agriculture, the word agriculture, with the word regeneration. You can look those two words up independently and they mean something. You put them together and it means agriculture that is causing regeneration or repair or restoration of something, an ecosystem, a farm, and its ability to function. So to address the climate question immediately, we say, well, how do we repair? Where does the substance, the stuff that actually repairs our farm come from? And the simple answer, which we'll probably get into more detail soon, is the carbon that's currently causing a problem in our atmosphere is actually the stuff that we need to source the repair. Meaning plants are taking the carbon that's in the atmosphere, pumping it out of their roots into the ground to feed microbes who are using that to build soil structure, and functioning ecosystems are the plant-soil connection being built together. So simply, it's really looking at an agricultural system that is repairing itself by using the carbon that's currently causing a bit of our climate crisis. The other side that's really important to address, Klaus, is this concept of resilience, where when we talk about climate crisis, a lot of what we're facing is how degraded our land is, and therefore how susceptible our land is to swings in temperature, to rainfall events, to drought events. When we have repaired, rebuilt healthy soil that's covered with living plants, we've created much more resilient systems that hold water when it rains instead of flooding and having runoff, or are able to supply plants with moisture for months and months instead of being hit by a drought. So when we look at the climate conversation as a solution to climate, it's really important that we also look at land function as a form of resilience against what's coming when we have higher temperatures, when we have bigger storms, longer droughts, longer periods of rainfall. So carbon sequestration, the function of building back the ecosystem with the carbon from the atmosphere that is the problem, and the resiliency factors are both what make up the climate solution in our eyes. And the difference between those other forms of agriculture is those ones you mentioned might not inherently mean that the land is regenerating or repairing, or that carbon sequestration is happening ongoingly, or that land function is increasing ongoingly. Regenerative agriculture can apply to all of those. Any of those systems can be regenerative, right? It just matters, are they actually regenerating over time?
Okay. So carbon in the atmosphere is creating the greenhouse effect, heating up the planet. We want to pull it down, put it into the ground, where it's actually a good thing to have.
Yeah, and where it's making our land more resilient for the storms that are happening right now today.
Right.
Yeah.
And providing the nutrients for the food.
Exactly.
So how does current US policy support farmers who farm regeneratively or who want to shift into a regenerative form of farming?
Great question. And currently we would say it doesn't very much whatsoever. there are big mechanisms that are technically supporting the continuation of what we would consider degenerative practices of farming that are actually degrading our land. So when we look at the soil health movement starting to enter its way into federal policy in the United States, for example, or state policy, which my colleague Kala Rose might be able to touch a bit more on, we're starting to see where government is able to look at incentive programs that are actually going towards soil health and regenerative agriculture versus perpetuating the funding of chemical fertilizer and chemical seed companies and big machinery like tillage equipment that is continually used to degrade our land. So to be quite honest, there's not very much right now, but in a state like California, there's been amazing progress that's happened here with our Healthy Soils Initiative and helping farmers to gain access to the education. And there's a lot of potential that we're looking at for the federal government of the United States to help get legislation that's actually going to help farmers on direct carbon payments, for example, which you're going to be bringing up, but also in a lot of ways that give them access to training so that they actually know how to do this and are supported to make this quite hard transition mentally for most farmers to make. Yeah.
Okay. Kala Rose, do you have some comments to add on that?
Well, in terms of policies that can support this, we have seen an incredible amount of action in this space over the last couple of years. We have 13 states with new policies related to promoting soil health in agriculture. And in fact, there's only about 7 or 8 states that are not looking at or have currently drafted or in the process of passing legislation related to soil health. So you're really seeing a huge explosion of this movement. And this really largely has been driven by advocates at the local level who have partnered with farmers and really centered that farmer in the conversation and really are trying to understand what that farmer needs to make these transitions and then communicate those needs to policymakers and show support for that. So we're really seeing a lot of action everywhere from water quality to direct payments for soil health practices in California, to incentive programs that really highlight producers who are actively participating in soil health. There's a wide range of things that we can do to support this, and it's been really incredible to see that work start to emerge over the past 5 years.
Okay.
And just one more add-on, I just put in there, you can follow a lot of the work that folks like Kala Rose and myself are involved in at soilpolicyaction.us. You can track a lot of what's happening at the state level and mimic it in your own state or get involved with supporting that. But when we talk about efforts that all of you can be a part of, things that are existing in current legislation, and we can provide those lists of different legislation that's coming out, but also the next farm bill is going to be a really huge opportunity for all of us to step in and engage in demanding that our farm/food bill is actually becoming more regenerative and helpful for farmers.
Okay. So staying with you, Kala Rose, what are carbon markets and what are their pros and cons? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the carbon market idea came out of the Kyoto Protocol, where you had a cap and trade type mechanism, right? So you put a cap on the amount of emissions that a sector can emit, but then you allow individual actors to trade. Let's say they produce less or under that cap, they can trade their credits. And then in that protocol, there was a mechanism for primarily it was developed for developing countries with forests to sequester carbon. And because the US never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, we never entered into any formal carbon market or what we would call a mandatory carbon market. We have primarily today are a lot of voluntary carbon markets. So markets where producers may create a sequestration type product or credit and then sell that on an open market to a buyer, maybe a company that wants to offset their carbon emissions. And that's ostensibly what we're looking at. The challenge with non-voluntary markets is financing, right? So when you have a mandatory market, the bank knows that those people are going to have to meet those emission reductions. They're going to have to buy those credits. There's a demand for those credits. It's much easier to finance something in a mandatory marketplace. A voluntary marketplace is much harder to finance and requires a lot of upfront capital, which means you really need to have buyers lined up for a long period of time. So absent sort of a mandatory marketplace, it's very challenging to get a robust voluntary marketplace going. That being said, there's a lot of folks in the United States, the Soil Health Institute, the Ecosystem Service Marketplace, NORI, and Indigo Ag that are all working on this voluntary carbon market side of the equation. Now, I also want to step back for a second and just kind of talk a little bit about what a credit is as a mechanism, because a credit is sort of the core concept of this idea. So it's like you get a ton of carbon and you get paid for it. Well, it's a very simple idea. And right now in the voluntary markets, sequestered carbon is going from anywhere between $15 to $20 a ton. There's not a lot of transactions happening, but that's sort of the price range that we're seeing for future markets that folks like Indigo Ag are telling us that are coming, or some small current transactions that are happening with NORI. So you get this $15 to $20 a ton. Okay, so sounds pretty good, but you have to verify that ton. And so the transaction cost for that product is very high. So maybe if you're lucky, 50 cents on that dollar gets to the farmer. So let's say you're getting $8 to $10 to the farmer. We see everything as low as 8 cents getting to the farmer, and the rest going to the transaction cost of monitoring, verification, all these different pieces. So not even the cost of doing the practices, but just getting that credit. It can cost you most of the money in that credit to get that credit. So already you're losing a lot of money in this process. It's very inefficient from a financial perspective overall. However, it is interesting to folks because this concept is like, great, I get to sequester carbon. I will just say it's very easy to measure carbon on a ton of gasoline, right? You know how much your emissions factor is for that gallon of gasoline, or that, the synthetic nitrogen that goes maybe into the operation. But measuring the amount of carbon that gets sequestered and how much stays in the soil for how long is very, very, very challenging, very costly, and frankly, highly differentiated, because these are living systems. Maybe it's a drought for 5 years and this soil dries out. We saw this in California, where acres that had had compost applied to them, they didn't actually lose carbon during the drought, and acres next to them lost carbon, but they didn't gain carbon during the drought. So they just didn't lose carbon, where the other systems lost carbon. So this is high variability in how much carbon gets absorbed every year, how much gets released back. And it's very challenging and very expensive to track in detail. So what states like California have done is they've used the USDA Comet Planner to estimate how much carbon could be sequestered. What a lot of folks are working on is how could satellite monitoring potentially help give us other indicators that would tell us the overall trends in these directions. Monitoring trends is much cheaper, more and more cost effective than trying to get that ton of carbon. The biological system just doesn't work that way. So I guess what you're hearing me say is there are two types of carbon markets, mandatory and voluntary. It's really hard to get the economics to work in a voluntary market, and the transaction costs in both markets are very, very high, meaning the amount of cents on that dollar getting to the farmer is pretty low. Let me just give you a quick example here. So on average in a row crop system in the Midwest, you might be able to get 1 ton of carbon per acre. So that's $15 to $20 per acre. If you're a farmer, that's maybe $8 to $10 per acre. Now, let's say that your crop insurance program kicks in that year because you've lost some value on your crop. The average payout for that crop insurance program is $480 an acre. So you start to think about, like, how effective is this policy really in terms of driving behavior and the amount of money that you can get into changing the system. And from an economic standpoint, while it is possible to make it work in some respects, and we've seen states like California, take a good stab at this with its Healthy Soils program, overall, it's a fairly inefficient mechanism for delivering funds to the farmer when you have these massive programs like the crop insurance program that create a specific incentive that's actually very large for that commodity. While I do appreciate folks really looking into these ideas, it's also important to look at the other policies that support agriculture and how they incentivize current practices, because in fact, there's much more money in them than there could ever be in the carbon market, unless you saw prices of carbon maybe quadruple or quintuple. So that's kind of where we're at with carbon markets.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was a lot. It's complicated. It's a complex topic. We'll come back to it with a couple more questions, but I wanted to go to Florence. And Florence, you have been working, with 3,000 farmers in South America. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that farmers face, not just in the US, but also in the countries that you work in terms of the US current agricultural policies?
Well, I think for humans everywhere, change is always difficult, and farmers maybe even more so if they've been farming for the same way for many years, if not many generations. And so I think that's true whether you're in the US or in countries in Central America where my organization works. And there's not enough support, in my opinion, for farmers who would like to make the transition to regenerative farming practices. For our work, we're really focused on the 500 million smallholder farmers in the world, which is about 90% of the 570 million farmers overall. And these are the farmers that don't control as much land, but they produce 80% of the world's food. And they could be producing a lot more with these regenerative organic practices, such as the ones that we help the farmers transition to. As far as US policy goes, that's honestly something that's relatively new for us as an organization. We've been very much focused on technical assistance and training, but are now seeing the importance of policy in order to get this kind of technical assistance to the hundreds of millions of farmers out there who we think would embrace it if given the chance. So just briefly, I'll mention a few observations, such as the fact that the US currently, I think last year they spent about $27 billion on foreign assistance. Of that $27 billion, about 942 million went to agriculture, so about 3%, which in my opinion is not nearly enough. If your objective is to get people out of poverty and allow them to feed themselves well and take care of our environment, which I think another 1% of that foreign aid went to environmental programs, it just seems that so much could be accomplished by investing in regenerative agriculture. And then of course, that 3% that goes to agriculture doesn't generally go to regenerative agriculture or the kind of practices that we'd like to see. It goes to programs that are generally pushing more use of chemicals. And in fact, if you dig down and you look at some of these programs that receive tens of millions of dollars in US foreign assistance, and you look after 3 years, what are the results? You see almost no improvement in food security, almost no improvement in income. You see there is an increase in the use of agrochemicals, which is of course not what those of us on the panel would like to be seeing as a result of our foreign assistance dollars. So that's an area, as we get more into policy issues, that we'd really like to see the needle move on. Our training program, which has been very successful, in all due humility, and helping farmers in the global south to transition to regenerative agriculture. We're thinking about scaling it to reach 1 million farms. So we're looking at bringing the cost down. We think we can get it down to about $750 over the course of 3 years to allow a farm to transition to regenerative agriculture. And so then just wrapping up my thought on that, if we're at that price point, it would cost just over $30 billion a year for 12 years to reach all 500 million of those smallholder farmers around the world, roughly equivalent to what the US currently spends on foreign assistance. So if we just think about, is there a way we can have them say dedicate 10% of that, along with 9 other countries putting in similar amounts, then we can get all of these benefits of ending poverty, ending food insecurity, stabilizing the climate, increasing biodiversity, decreasing social unrest, and the list goes on and on, all with just this one approach. And so that's really what we'll be looking at as we think about the policy side of our work, and welcome others more knowledgeable, such as people on this panel, and learning more from them about it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So the of course, Citizen Climate Lobby, we're focused on legislation, and our members are citizen lobbyists. So there is a great deal of interest in this conversation. So Finian, if I can poke one more time here, what role do you see for government subsidies and or private sector incentives to assist farmers and ranchers with adopting new management strategies? I mean, what are the most effective ways to assist farmers?
That's a great question, Klaus. A lot of what we hear from folks who are on the ground training farmers is kind of threefold. I'm going to start with the general one, which is the education being available, because farmers in the U.S. especially are reaching a threshold, and the kind of the bailouts of what we just saw this last year, with 40% of their income coming from essentially subsidies that are just handed out from the government to kind of help them in the crisis that was with China, et cetera. But most farmers are struggling and increasing their debt at a rate of 4% every year. That's the average for the United States farmer. So what we've seen in the last 20 years is farmers really starting to look at the desperate situation that they're really in, the increased cost of inputs, and really what they're dealing with to make ends meet. So it's a struggle. So the first thing is, where and how is education available? And when we look at how the government, whether it's federal or state, is handing out subsidies or getting direct payments to farmers, how can we start to integrate options for training, either making those mandatory with aid when it comes, or providing access to those, so that farmers are given an opportunity to start learning from the best trainers in regenerative agriculture, so that they can actually reliably make these transitions without losing yields and immediately cutting costs in year 1 or year 2, so that they can actually make this transition confidently. Another big aspect is ongoing support. As Florence just mentioned, the support network for farmers is crucial, because if you think about the general space or context that these farmers are in, if they jump into regenerative agriculture all by their lonesome in a certain part of Iowa, let's say, the peer pressure around them to dump that new trajectory and go back to the way that they were doing before is pretty big. They're getting a lot of peer-to-peer pressure. They're also just getting what they've been entrenched in for years, and pressure from chemical companies, et cetera, and their crop advisors, et cetera. So how are we creating the support networks to support them? We're working more on looking at where are there public-private partnerships on that, so that we can actually give access to the best and the brightest of the trainers and the best and the brightest of the people who are being sought after in their communities to give guidance. How can we get those people paid instead of just the people who are sometimes 20, 30 years behind the curve in terms of what they can offer farmers? So that's something. And then third, I want to mention loans and financing. A lot of how that's structured is really not helpful for farmers. Farmers are looking most years on how they're going to pay back the loan. That doesn't give them very much room to look at how they're going to invest in the future of their farm being regenerative, whether it's new fences for doing rotational grazing or adding livestock to their operation, or whether it's no-till equipment, or whether it's some other form of their farm becoming regenerative. Their loan financing options, just to be really as brief as possible here, aren't constructive for a future of building a regenerative farm. They're kind of on a payback cycle to get their principal paid on an arbitrary payment deadline in terms of their farm transitioning to regenerative. So those are the 3 areas: general education, support networks, and financing are 3 areas that we can really help state and federal policy push.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Could I just jump
oh,
in with one other piece to add to that I forgot previously? And that's the fact that many of these farmers are smallholder farmers. And so market access is a real challenge for them. And that's very much true where we work. And then also for, I think, a lot of the regenerative farmers in this country as well. So having better support for aggregating crops in order to get them to markets and other systems like that to build out that ecosystem are important. That's
And
something
then-
the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance is working on, and others too, I'm sure.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Florence, it's like the processing. You know, we have tons of processing in places you can drop off your soy and corn, but not very many that you can even do harvesting of livestock or that you can even process your sunflowers. So the processing capacity is something that the government could really help with. And then especially for local folks, I always encourage this is localized. You can actually directly, any of you on this call could, in the next several months, help to shift purchasing agreements for the institutions in your communities. And that can be a really low-hanging fruit for an activist who doesn't have a bunch of background in soil science or ag policy. You can go into your local councils or your school districts and start working with them to change their purchasing agreements, which are directly able to support farmers who are transitioning to regenerative and get them at the front of the line to sell their products and make sure they have a market so they don't have to go find an international market that's really susceptible to wackiness and big buyouts. So those are things that you can do immediately. The last thing I want to talk about, because you talked about risk in the original question here, Klaus, when we can have farmers saving money in year 1 or year 2 by reducing their input cost, this is a huge one. As Calla Rose talked about, carbon markets are cool in some ways, but there are ways that farmers can save, you know, somewhere around $200,000 for some of these 3,000 acre farms on their second year because they're just cutting their input costs. Input costs are so high for conventional farmers. We can help them reduce their input costs, and that will give them so much more bandwidth and funds to do movement towards regenerative.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, and of course, over the last 30, 40 years, the entire traditional aggregation capacity has been pretty much taken apart because all the co-ops and so on. And so Calla Rose question to many of our volunteers here asking, how do you view the Growing Climate Solutions Act? You know, what are the upsides and downsides that you would consider? Is this a good bill? Is this, what are your thoughts?
Well, what I think is really great about the Growing Climate Solutions Act is that it's bipartisan. And right now, we really, really need to focus on things that we can do across the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, especially in light of the divisions within our country. It's really important that we find ways to come together. And even if it's just baby steps are some steps at all. So I think that part of the bill is really great. I think with some revisions, you could deal with a lot of the issues. And a lot of those issues stem from the fact that the mechanism for delivering funds to farmers is really going to favor large scale commodity growers. And it's not going to deal with all of these issues around small farmers who actually produce most of the food in the country benefiting. And it's not going to kind of give them an economy of, they don't have the economies of scale that these big farmers do. I think the transaction costs associated with the credit mechanism are really prohibitively high. You can look at what the Healthy Soils Policy did in terms of referencing the suite of USDA COMET tool as a general reference instead of requiring measurement and verification. That brings down the transaction costs a lot. So if you could get the transaction costs for that mechanism in the Growing Climate Solutions Act down, as in more money gets to the farmer, and it's more accessible to other farmers and to small scale farmers, I think you could do a lot to make that bill better. There are going to be credit.
You're breaking up, Calla Rose. We just lost you. Your internet froze up. Maybe we'll go back to Finian for a moment. Finian, when we train our volunteers at CCL, Yeah, sorry.
You're cut out right now.
Yeah. Um, we often tell them do not talk about climate change with farmers or the Farm Bureau, because the moment you mention climate change, then the conversation ends. And when we go offline and talk with them about what is the reason for that, a lot of them are saying that they're worried about poorly designed regulations coming their way. They just don't. It's just a lack of trust in the process. How do we go beyond this? I mean, how do we move beyond dealing
Yeah.
with reality? Yeah?
I think it's a great conversation. It's one that we always are up against, every single one of us. We're all coming from our own individual context and passion, right? I'm an extremely passionate person. And I think one of the most amazing things about the regenerative agriculture movement is it's a very holistically thinking movement, Klaus, where you have practitioners and leaders in this space who are looking at so many different facets all at once. And so when you are equipped with the kind of breadth of what happens to an ecosystem when a human being or human beings are involved as stewards to reconnect with it and build with it and regenerate with it, there's so many benefits. And that's where, depending on who you're talking to, I encourage all my advocates who we train in soil advocate training is to look at who you're talking with it and connect with where they're at. The good news is you don't have to pitch carbon sequestration potential to someone on their personal farm if they don't care about carbon sequestration. If they are more concerned about their finances, or if they're more concerned about their continued erosion for the last 3 years, or their soil loss, or the fact that they have to deworm all of their animals all the time, or the fact that they're getting lower yields. There are so many practical applications for farmers on regenerating their land. And that's where we choose to work with some of the best farmer trainer groups in the world, arguably, because they're able to get the best results for their farmers, which, yes, do equal carbon sequestration numbers that are the best. But that doesn't matter, because if a farmer doesn't care about carbon sequestration in general as a climate solution and their part in it, that's fine. They can care about their bottom line. They can care about their profitability and their net margins. They can care about their bird population species coming back, whatever there is. And that's where we look at multiple areas. And that's where it's up to the advocate to be nimble and put a smile on your face. Realize that just because you've learned a little bit about this, you're probably not as smart as the farmer in some aspects. In some aspects, you might have things that they don't know. Be humble, be willing to be nimble, and be willing to converse and learn at the same time and share. And one of the easiest things is remembering that yourself is, in most scenarios, you'll be seen as peer-to-peer, right? If you're feeling that you're getting pushback because you're seen as just a peer-to-peer, my argument versus your argument, bringing in an outside person's voice, whether it's through a video that you see or a book that they've written, and lending it to that person you're conversing with can be such a better way to approach them having a breakthrough than just trying to pound against them because you think you know it's right.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So I'd like to come to probably one of the hottest topics. I mean, the questions are sort of coalescing around livestock, and from multiple perspectives. One is from I don't eat animals, I'm vegan, vegetarian, to animals are destructive for the land, and so on. Maybe Florence, will start with you here. What is the role of animals on the farm, and how do you see that integrated?
You say for me?
Yeah, could you, and then we'll give it to Finian.
Oh, okay. Well, in our programs, we see animals as being part of a healthy ecosystem. And personally, myself, I eat mostly vegetarian, and I personally feel that there's a limit to how much meat it makes sense for humans to consume, but I still think that there is a role for it. And it's, as I say, animals are part of a healthy ecosystem. So on most of the farms that Sustainable Harvest works with, we help the families with the animals that seem most appropriate for their farms, which are often chickens. And the chickens produce manure, which improves the soil. They eat the insects. They provide a number of benefits, as do other animals on the farms. In some cases, iguanas are real popular. And so instead of yard chickens, the families have yard iguanas. And we help them with those systems as well. Fish ponds are another one where the water from the fish ponds can then be taken down to provide nutrients to crops downstream from the fish ponds. So we find ways to work animals in as part of the overall ecosystem on the farm. And I think that that's appropriate for farmers who want to do that.
Okay. So
Yeah, it's a great question. Oh, I have to move to I'm gonna have to move to my headphones set, but I'm gonna try to move while I'm answering this question. So pardon me, y'all. This is gonna get dark for a second, but I'm just moving because that's what happens in the times of COVID when you have a family. So my answer to this question first would be the recognition to people who are someone who's vegan, who's taken that effort on. I just want to commend people for that, because it is really extraordinary to flex that in what we're dealing with every day as consumers, and to make that effort. So it is a very commendable effort. As I've been a vegetarian and vegan many times in my life, and more of a flexitarian at the current moment. But as you get into regeneration of living ecosystems, life begets life really starts to pound on your mind. And what I mean by that is, when we look at the animal, coupling the animal with an ecosystem, it's often the animal that is a huge part of having that system actually regenerate. So when we look at landscapes, especially in brittle environments, to put people in this context, something that's missed in this discussion a lot is the difference between brittle and non-brittle environments. A non-brittle environment will tend to have tree species quickly emerge and grow back. So if you clear land in upstate New York, where I'm from, in Ithaca, a field will turn back into a forest very quickly. 5 or 6 years, it'll become a small forest. If you do the same thing in New Mexico or somewhere else that's a brittle environment, meaning for 50% of the year, it's very low moisture in the air, that system will remain degraded and not regenerate very quickly. And why that is those systems, in most cases, we look at vast areas of Africa, Middle East, etc. You look at conditions where what evolved are deep-rooted perennial grass systems that are able to withstand long periods of drought and then take advantage of large downpours of rain or periods of rain. So they are the most miraculous sponge creators. Tree canopy situations don't create miraculous sponge capacity ground. They have leaf litter ground, and the plant's leaves slow the fall of the rain, and that's how they deal with it. But when you talk about sponge creation in vast grasslands, okay, you gotta be quiet here. Sorry, I'm on a thing that's going right now. Sorry about that. In vast grasslands, they're creating a sponge that, if you look at bare ground, for example, in Texas, average ranch is infiltrating water at 1/2 inch an hour. You convert to regenerative agriculture, increase your grassland's ability to absorb water. 2 to 3 years, you're infiltrating 1/2 inch of water in 10 seconds. So when we look at brittle environments, we have to consider that the natural phenomenon, what we're trying to get back to, is a really high functioning grassland system. You can't do that without ruminants. They evolved with those grassland systems. So when we have no buffalo or bison left to do it, using cattle to do it is actually one of the most effective things for brittle environments, because you can't just plant trees, because those natural environments are not supposed to be tree canopy environments. They're supposed to be vast grasslands.
Very good, thank you. So we have reports coming back from farmers and ranchers that for small scale producers, it's extremely difficult to get into the market. I mean, even I live in Bend, Oregon, and we have a thriving local food system, but it's very difficult to buy local meat. It's almost impossible. When we talk to them, I mean, I went around and talked to a number of these smaller farmers, like 40 acres, 60 acres, and so on. And they're saying they have to book time at an abattoir more than a year out to process their animal. What is causing that? What is happening there?
That's the lack of the centralization of processing facilities has been really alarming. I mean, we've had losses and losses of processing facilities as regulations have gone up, and USDA has kind of regulated and made it so that you have to have super high procedures. We've lost a lot of small processing facilities, but something like the PRIME Act, which we support at Kiss the Ground, it's a very right-wing supported piece of legislation, but it's helping for localized processing so that ranchers and farmers can actually start to process locally so that they can bring in livestock to help their operations. Because at the current moment, you're looking at sometimes 500 to 1,000 miles they're traveling just to get to a processing facility. So yes, we definitely need to add to regenerative agriculture legislation localized processing facilities to make this a reality for farmers and ranchers.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to stay on there for another moment. The PRIME Act, as I understand it, is decentralizing the USDA jurisdiction and allows states to control or regulate their own meat markets. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the current version of it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that would be apparently a really important piece of legislation to look at as well. Coming back to Florence here, what do you think about the argument that organic food is fine for wealthy hippies, but that synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and GMOs are needed to feed the world's hungry? So can regenerative produce enough food to feed the population?
In my experience, it absolutely can. The 3,000 smallholder farmers who have worked with us over the last 23 years have been able to dramatically increase their production by switching to regenerative organic practices. And we know that it's working for them because we go back many years later and we've found that 91% of them are continuing to use those practices even after they are finished with our program, and they're continuing to produce more, eat better, sell more. So we've seen that from our own experience, and then also just in the reading that I've done, that it also backs up what we've seen on a much larger scale. One study that I read that looked at 286 projects with smallholder farmers on 37 million hectares of land in 57 different countries found that regenerative organic practices increased yields by 79% on average. So between what we see day to day in our work and these many studies that I read, I feel that absolutely regenerative is the way that we are going to feed the world. It's not going to be with the green revolution and the agrochemicals that I think were well intentioned and maybe gave some boosts in the short term, but now we see hunger going up again in the world for the first time in many years. And we see how these promises of chemical fertilizers and promises of GMOs have not panned out the way they said they would, whereas the regenerative organic practices are delivering, and they're delivering long term. And that's why I feel like the smallholder farmers have such a contribution to make, because I think it's for them, it's easiest to make that transition to these practices. They have so much to gain from it and very little to lose in making that transition.
Okay, Carla-Rose, you have some comments there too?
Yeah, I hope that my internet stays stable. So
Okay.
I will try to respond. It's a total myth that we can't grow enough food with these types of practices. And what we should understand is that we currently produce enough calories to feed everyone alive. It's not about enough calories anymore. It's about equity and distribution of that food, access to that food. And if those calories are in corn and soy or dairy and beef instead of the majority of the food that actually feeds people, legumes, potatoes, grains, vegetables, fruits, these types of nut crops, chickens, like bird meats, those types of foods, most of the food is produced, most of the calories are produced by these commodity farms like big corn, big soy, huge cattle growing operations. But most of the food in the world is produced by these small scale holders that Florence is talking about. Even in the US, a lot of our food is coming from these types of farms. What the thing is that our policy and our infrastructure is geared all towards the commodity farms and not towards supporting those people who actually grow food. So one, this idea that there's not enough food to feed people is a complete myth. There is. And two, if we were to switch from producing so many of those commodities towards producing diversified, small scale produced food, we would produce even more food that could feed people in a healthier way than we are now.
And I just want to add one thing that Carla-Rose said what I wanted to say, but the one part is so many farmers have been duped and become addicted to, even small scale farmers across India, for example. The rate of farmer suicide is because they essentially had their farms hijacked and addicted to the short-term gains that extreme amounts of chemical fertilizer and or these expensive seeds will give them. And now they're in a situation where regeneration is really important for them to be successful. So just going back to organic on highly degraded land, they have to have some help, and the coordination for regenerative is super important so their landscapes actually function again and they can do it without high input costs.
Okay, thank you. That was a great conversation. You were amazing. So we're coming towards the end of the hour here, and I think we have covered most of the questions in sort of in summary form here. So I wanted to give you a chance to make some concluding comments to the volunteers that are listening in here, who are all engaged in climate change mitigation in some form or another. And I also wanted to say that we have a team that from the Chico chapter in California that is working to follow up and wanting to recruit volunteers to actually engage with farmers to help us, Citizen Climate Lobby, understand more of the issues that farmers are struggling with and how that should influence policy decisions. And so how about Finian, shall we start with you? You want to make some concluding comments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Klaus. Thanks for everyone for being here. The first thing I want to do is just really invite everyone that this is your movement to become involved. The soil health and regenerative agriculture movement is really one of the most inclusive, non-competitive, and cooperative movements that I've ever been a part of as a lifelong activist. With Kiss the Ground, we're always out there working to connect different aspects of this movement and connect people to it and give them access and make it possible. So you can, of course, host a screening of Kiss the Ground if you want. You can check out Kiss the Ground for our impact fund if you're interested in that or helpful in that way. But also go to Kiss the Ground to find your path. This is a really interesting tool we made. It's the get involved or take action part of our site. And it's a chance for you to explore based on your interest what might be available for you. So go find your path. Of course, follow us on social and everything. Kiss the Ground's role in the movement, I just wanted to clarify that we are continuing to make media. So if you're interested in helping spread that out to the world, of course, that helps us. We're also dedicated to training advocates. So I personally, my biggest prerogative is to get people empowered about this subject so that you can be out there advocating in whatever way is comfortable to you, but that you're continuously getting more proficient and profound in your ability to advocate at high levels. And you can take our soil advocate training online, and the cohort for that starts on February 3rd. So you can do it with other people, which is really fun. Of course, you can help our farmland program. So this is a way you can directly help farmers transition by helping the grants that help farmers get access to the premier education for them to transition and ongoing support. And then I encourage everyone to start composting. Take that challenge for yourself, commit to it. When you commit to something, you tend to go a step beyond just one time. You say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to YouTube videos. If I fail the first time, we have tons of resources on our page to help you do that. And then start planting something. But there's so much room, no matter what your skill set, whether you're an artist or an entrepreneur or someone who has data skills, there's so much room. This is like the .com era was in the 90s. So there's so much room for you and your skills to be utilized in what I consider this to be one of the most critical movements of our time, to not just decarbonize our markets, but to actually repair and regenerate our earth that's heavily degraded. So the last thing I want to end on is the situation is dire. As the film pointed out, we're heading off a cliff, and regeneration is that rewarding experience that we can all be a part of. So I encourage everyone to get involved and look forward to connecting with you. And thank you, Klaus, and everyone at Citizens Climate Lobby for putting this together.
Thank you, Finian. Florence, do you have some final comments?
Well, not too much to add. Finian covered so much, and it's wonderful to be part of a group that is so active on so many fronts. So I'll just put in the plug to also keep in mind the smallholder farmers in the global south that do themselves have the potential to be drawing down at least 6 billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere every year in their farming practices. Collectively, the soil could be sequestering, I think, around 50 billion tons of carbon, but there's also the trees. And while some areas, as Finian said, are much more appropriate for grasslands, where we work in Central America, that used to be 90% forest, and they've lost so much of the forest there and in other parts of the world. And so that's another place where we can be drawing down carbon. We could increase forest cover by 25% and capture another 200 billion tons of atmospheric carbon. And that doesn't have to be forests just for the sake of forests, which are wonderful. They can be agroforestry systems that produce an abundance of food and other crops while also contributing to this regenerative agriculture movement. So I'll just ask everybody to please do keep in mind the farmers in the global south who are trying to make the shift to regenerative agriculture and need our support at the policy level, at donation level, and volunteer level, whatever it may be. And thanks so much for letting me be part of this event.
You bet. Yeah, Carla-Rose, do you have a couple of words?
Yeah, I'm so sorry about dropping out earlier. I'm living in a very rural place right now. So really appreciate talking with you all. I just appreciate that you do this work, Klaus, and everybody. Thanks for organizing. Democracy is a long haul. No one bill is perfect. We have to do a lot of bills. We have to keep going and keep moving forward. We have to keep building bridges with other communities. Farmers themselves, people who have suffered from discrimination in the U.S. agriculture, Black people, brown people, Native people who have been pushed off their lands. We can really begin to reach out and support others who will also benefit from these things and from whom we will benefit in this movement. So I just appreciate you all being here. The advocacy makes all the difference. Honestly, it really is true that a small group of advocates can change the course of U.S. policy. And I'm really grateful for all that you all do in that manner and for helping and joining in with the soil health movement. Check out all those resources Finian listed. And remember that we have these huge foreign aid programs that influence how people in other countries do agriculture. And as American citizens, we can have voices in how those programs spend money too. So thanks so much, everybody. Your voice really, really matters. And I appreciate you all speaking up.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And I just wanted to call out this big thank you to this big team of volunteers that made this all possible. As Catherine from the Kiss the Ground, who has just been amazing in getting us all organized, and that Randy and Kate and Paul and Julie, there are too many to mention, Ben, Ting Ting. So we've had a really big team working on this, and we will follow up and keep going with it. So thank you, and we'll say bye-bye.